Hello everyone, internationally wanted criminal Bad Empanada here, coming at you from an undisclosed location as I am on the run from numerous serious criminal charges and also lawsuits. Today I am also decidedly less orange than in my previous videos, though one thing that still is orange juice. I'm not going to drink it just in case some of you have some sort of fetish that involves your favorite streamer / YouTuber drinking orange juice. Not gonna happen. So there was a clip doing the rounds last week of the ADL chairman or leader or whatever he calls himself, Jonathan Greenblat, just plain doing like Nazi race science stuff but for Jews, like openly on television or in an interview for social media or whatever it was. And I just wanted to talk about this because this is something that I've talked about before. It's something that is very related to the concept of Jewish exceptionalism that I have been talking about a lot over the last year or so, where like this idea that Jews are eternal, everlasting victims because of the Holocaust and historical Jewish oppression has been pushed and weaponized to justify Israel doing Jewish ethno-nationalism, which in today's age would otherwise be considered unacceptable, if not for this special caveat, this special like pass that is given only to Jews to do things that if they were being done by like any other ethnic group or any other so-called race of people, they would be getting called out for, like, you know, white nationalism, Aryan nationalism, even black nationalism sometimes. So before we get to the clip specifically, I want to play a funny clip that I've been showing for like 4 or 5 years now when I first started talking about this thing. That is Tucker Carlson, back when he used to be like a mainstream news presenter still on Fox News rather than like this weird like fake anti-Israel right-wing conservative influencer who posts interviews on Twitter that he is now. He actually called out Jonathan Greenblat for this consistent double standard that he has espoused, where Greenblat and the ADL always talk about how important it is to like protect Israel's Jewish majority and prevent an influx of Arabs with high birth rates and stuff like that to Israel. And then on the other side of things, he talks about how like immigrants must be welcome to the USA and we can't afford to divide ourselves based on race or ethnicity and all this stuff. So two very contradictory narratives that he has there. It's basically like ethno-nationalism / nativism is fine for me in Israel, but in my second country or my primary country, the USA, it shouldn't be permissible. Israel is special because it's Jewish, is the entire logic of that. And Tucker Carlson, in spite of being a disgusting right-wing propagandist who has flip-flopped like 20 times on the Israel issue, depending on whatever will make him more money in the moment, clocked him on this perfectly when he called out Jonathan Greenblat for what Tucker Carlson basically implied was Greenblat saying that ethno-nationalism is fine for Jews but not fine for white people, which is what Tucker Carlson has been pushing for quite a while now, white ethno-nationalism. So here's the clip in question, which I first included in one of my videos 3 years ago now, more than 3 years ago. He basically made the point that if it's okay for Israel to say that, why can't he say it about the US and white people?
You wonder if people even debate questions like this in countries that don't hate themselves, countries like Japan or South Korea or Israel. Go to the Anti-Defamation League's website sometime if you'd like a glimpse of what an unvarnished conversation about a country's national interest might look like. In a short essay posted to the site, the ADL explains why the state of Israel should not allow more Arabs to become citizens with voting rights. Quote, with historically high birth rates among the Palestinians and a possible influx of Palestinian refugees and their descendants now living around the world, the ADL explains, Jews would quickly become a minority within a binational state, thus likely ending any semblance of equal representation and protections. In this situation, the Jewish population would be increasingly politically and potentially physically vulnerable. It is unreal.
I just want to note there, like the way this is framed is like, we are depriving rights from this other group of people in order to protect Jews. That is specifically like a framing that is generally made for Israel, mostly for Israel. I mean, obviously there's like a persecution complex among all ethno-nationalism, but this is only ever really accepted in the case of Israel. And the reason why it is accepted in the case of Israel is Jewish exceptionalism, is this idea that Jews are always oppressed no matter what, even when we're talking about like rich millionaire white guys living in Bel Air. So times never change, politics never change, situations never change, material conditions never change. The idea is that everyone should always think of Jews as like concentration camp inmates in striped jumpsuits like that from Schindler's List or something, and ignore how things have actually changed since then. To the point of today where Jews in the West are accepted as a subgroup of white people, by broader society. They are certainly not oppressed. And even if they were, that would not exactly justify them colonizing and displacing an entire other group of people to form their own little ethno-state, would it? So this sort of argument falls apart on its own logic, but the point that I'm making here is the reason why it can mislead so many people into buying its premise is because of this Jewish exceptionalism. This idea that Jews are literally an exception to all the norms and rules that other people abide by, and all of the standards that they have accepted as normal. Thus, Israel being a clear and open ethno-state is okay because it's protecting Jews who are always in peril. In this case, they're literally framing Jews in Israel as potential victims of the people who they have been victimizing, dispossessing, raping, genociding for over 100 years at this point. It's ridiculous, right?
Realistic and unacceptable, the ADL continues, to expect the state of Israel to voluntarily subvert its own sovereign existence and nationalist identity and become a vulnerable minority within what was once its own territory, end quote. Now, from Israel's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would any democratic nation make its own citizens less powerful? Isn't that the deepest betrayal of all? In the words of the ADL, why would a government subvert its own sovereign existence? Good question. Maybe ADL President Jonathan Greenblat will join us sometime to explain and tell us whether that same principle applies to the United States. Most Americans believe it does.
So there you go. Basically, that's Tucker Carlson, white nationalist, calling out Jonathan Greenblat, the head of the ADL, for being okay with ethnic nationalism just only for Jews. And, you know, his reasoning for calling him out on this is obviously, you know, far-right white nationalist bullshit, but the premise of what he's saying here isn't incorrect. Jonathan Greenblat is against ethno-nationalism for everyone but himself. And once you notice this, you notice it everywhere with pro-Israel people. So it's not surprising that Jonathan Greenblat would just like go and openly talk about like how Jews marrying non-Jews is a problem, as if it's the most normal thing in the world, because he's been saying this sort of thing for years. And white nationalists themselves have been saying, hey, you know, he's right there. We agree with him, but we think we should be able to do that as well for years as well. So here's the video in question. It's literally called The ADL versus Hate. What a absolutely comical title for an interview in which the ADL head outright said that interracial marriage between Jews and non-Jews is a problem that needs to be dealt with. Unbelievable. And I just want to note here how astroturfed everything regarding the ADL is. These people don't have an organic following. No one gives a shit about what they say in reality, but they are like a lobby group that leverages like a lot of, you know, people with money, a lot of political power against people who say things that they don't want to be allowed to be said, particularly anti-Israel speech. So their head ends up being planted and given like interviews, which no one ever watches and no one at all cares about, because no one actually cares about him or his organization. The only reason why these organizations are relevant is because like if you say the wrong thing about Israel, for example, they and other groups like them can make it look like there is some sort of outrage about that when there really isn't, and get you fired from your job as a result because your employer or whatever doesn't want to deal with what looks like something that could potentially ruin their business if they don't get rid of you for that. This guy has so many interviews and like they get like 15,000 views, and then people critiquing him and mocking him gets 200,000 views. It's so inorganic, it's almost absurd, right? But anyway, so here's the part of the interview in question that we're specifically talking about here. The ADL versus hate. This guy is presently justifying and enthusiastically supporting a mass genocide of babies in Gaza, of little children, of non-combatants. Every single day they just massacre them. They're raping random Palestinian boys, literal children, in the ass with heated metal rods. And this guy is the Tsar of anti-hatred in the USA. Give me a fucking break. What this guy wants is permission to do genocide. He wants to manufacture consent for Jews specifically to be allowed to do genocide, to be allowed to do racial hatred, racial killing, racial rape in Israel. And the hate that he's talking about is, most of it, what the ADL serves to oppose, it's not actually like racial hatred in general. It's specifically people who grow to hate Israel and to hate Zionism because of what Israel and Zionists do and say. He's against that hate, an actual justified hate, not based on race, not based on ethnicity, not based on innate characteristics, based on ideology, politics, action, who you are as human beings. That is what he is against. That is what he really means here when he says the ADL versus the hate. So here is the controversial segment in question.
Your sense that Jewish people are getting complacent, that they're not engaging to degrees and levels we should be?
I have met a lot of October 8th Jews for whom the massacre on October 7th was a wake-up call. I've met a lot of people who feel much more galvanized, much more organized. But that will only be sustained if we offer them, ways to participate in a real and robust way in Jewish life.
Mm-hmm. And whose responsibility is that, in essence?
All of ours.
Yeah.
But this is why we need a revolution in our community on so many levels. So look, the reality is that intermarriage rates continue to go up. Assimilation continues apace. And look, I fight anti-Semitism. That is my job.
Right.
But I worry a great deal about broader questions of Jewish identity, as I think we talked about over lunch. And so I think it's...
This guy is basically like an Aryan ethno-nationalist complaining about Aryan intermarriage and Aryan assimilation into some amorphous blob identity, and the Aryan identity being subsumed by a greater whole. That is what he's talking about here. It is the kind of blatantly obvious racial ethno-nationalism that would never be acceptable without this framework of Jewish exceptionalism. It is Nazi shit, as many others would say, sure, but I think it's also important to point to the reasons why so many normal people hearing this stuff will nod along with it, rather than calling it out for what it is, which is blatantly obvious Nazi ethno-nationalist style talking points by a fanatical pro-genocide Zionist, who are the closest thing presently existing to Nazism in their ideology and practice. And the reason why people don't peg this for what it really is Jewish exceptionalism. People are conditioned to believe that Jews are basically in the same status of peril as they were in 1940. Thus, this endless bullshit about a supposed anti-Semitism crisis that just so happens to coincide with Israel doing outright physical genocide designed to get rid of all Palestinians of Gaza. Because how can you justify something like that? Well, you can't, but you can try by trying to frame the people who are doing it as innate victims who have some sort of innate right to do it because of that innate victim status. Now, this is not a sensible ideology. It's not a sensible justification. None of it makes sense if you think about it for 2 seconds, but you're not supposed to think about it. You're supposed to just accept this as the way that things are. You're supposed to accept that the social status of Jews globally has not changed in the past 80 years, and especially not regarding Jews in Israel. You're supposed to think that they are repressed, that they are merely reacting to this supposed oppression or a supposed threat against them, and thus they are justified in what they are doing. And that's why someone like this can just go and shamelessly say this sort of thing out in the open and not get called out for it by anyone in the mainstream and anyone who's unattentive and who hasn't really thought about this before, in spite of the fact that, if you change the word Jew here for any other group, basically, like white, German, Italian, whatever, people would immediately clock it for what it was. Hell, even if he was talking about black intermarriage rates, people would get angry at that because it's hey, black people might be a historically oppressed group, but it's kind of weird to self-enforce race science among yourselves on that basis. And even if in the case of black people, it might be a lot more understandable, as they are a whole lot more oppressed actually today than Jews are, it's still something that I think we all want to avoid. It's still hardly an ideal to strive for that we should support. People self-segregating on a racial basis and intentionally avoiding polluting their gene pool or whatever. But this isn't even that. This is ultimately a group of people who in the West, if anything, endure no systemic oppression whatsoever, and in Israel, where half of the Jews of the world live, they get perverse benefits on the basis of their ethnicity. So, ask the question of where's the oppression today? Where is this supposed peril that justifies this? And all that you really see is Israel inflicting that upon others, not it being inflicted upon them. And the narrative just falls down even on its own terms, but the fact of the matter is that when you think about it for 2 seconds, this would not be justified even if those terms were true. Because we all know that ethno-nationalism is wrong now. We've all moved past it. When I say all, I mean the majority of people watching this in the world, moral standards have shifted and changed. Now people do not think ethno-nationalism is okay, but because so many people just sort of passively accept Jewish exceptionalism without thinking about it, someone like this can present the notion that for Jews it somehow magically is. It's not. There's nothing new that he's saying here. He's been saying the same sort of things for many years now, and I'm glad that more people are noticing it and paying attention to the fine print in his words and just how disgusting and gross it is. And I think the ADL and organizations like them, their time is really almost up. People are more and more realizing how bullshit this sort of rhetoric is. And the fact that they have like no real organic following of their own, as you can see from the fact that no one wants to watch what this guy actually has to say except to mock it, means that there is eventually going to be like a super critical, massive criticism against these organizations, of people turning against them, people being fed up with what they're saying, realizing how bullshit it is, and they're just going to end up withering away. The problem with that is, though, Israel is massacring people right now, and the fact that, 5-10 years in the future, this stuff isn't going to have the power that it has now is no solace to them. So that's still a big issue. But yeah, I just wanted to cover this and talk about how this is nothing new, and post another video that will end up being tacked on to my long list of criminal charges from which I am presently fleeing. Goodbye.